Boom. This one might ruffle a few feathers. But today, guys, on the Spectrum of Health podcast, we're going to talk about why modern men have become so weak. Why? And I've got some stats and some information that's going to back up the title of this podcast. Before I move forward with anything, please don't forget to like, share, subscribe. I would really appreciate that. And if you find some value from this episode, and if you need any support after this episode, please don't hesitate to reach out, because I'm on a mission to help 1,000 men transform their bodies. I've already done 100, so I'm trying to get 900 more. Let's do this. So I did a lot of research for this episode, and I went through about 3 or 4 different studies and how they were conducted. So I'm going to go through a few things, and I want you to bear in mind that if you are someone who feels weak and you're a guy and you feel weak, I have got something for you at the end of the episode as well. So feel free to continue to listen. The Journal of Hand Strength, I didn't know there was a Journal of Hand Strength out there in the research world, but they reported that grip strength now is a lot weaker than it was in the 1980s and 1970s. They did a study in North Carolina. In that study, the force of grip strength in the men over the last 40 years has declined. All right, the force has dropped by about 15 to 20 pounds. There's another line of research that actually shows us that grip strength is a great indicator for metabolic health, the longevity of your life, so your lifespan, and also is a great indicator of any other future health problems or health implications. That's one study, right? That's one study. There's another study, University of Australia. They actually found that kids, they did a meta-analysis. So that's where they study other studies, and they found that kids were actually fitter 30 years ago. Right, so these little kids, they were actually fitter. They had better aerobic fitness 30 years ago than they do now. And aerobic fitness is basically training in the presence of oxygen, using oxygen as an energy source. So that could be like a long run, like a 5K or a 10K where you're steadily running along. And there's a third study. This one is obviously the worst one for men, in my opinion, is testosterone levels have been dropping by about 1% per year. That's average testosterone levels across men in the United States. Obviously, I'm in the UK. We've got similar culture, similar lifestyle. I would assume it's something similar in the UK too. That was a USA study. In that same study, they actually found that a 65-year-old man in the 1980s had 17% more testosterone than the average man now in 2022. Or by the time this is out, probably 2023. That's a 17% difference in average men. Obviously, for us guys who are above average, it doesn't matter. But that's a bit scary, right? Like, that scares me. That scares me. So that's 3, well, I said 4 things really. That's 4 major things that are very, very problematic when it comes to guys. So let's talk about why this is happening, what we can do about it, and I'm gonna give you something that I think you can do about it too. Okay, so why is this happening? The first reason why it's happening is I think that, how do I say this? I think that there's a structural imbalance happening in the world right now. There's a structural imbalance happening in the world that is causing people, men specifically, to become more feminine. That's the only way I can kind of say it, which is actually against male nature. Like, historically, it's been against male nature. Whatever you think about the way the world is now versus how it could be and what it should be, that's irrelevant. It is against male nature to be feminine, hence we have women and men. There's a reason for that. We didn't make this up. It happens for a reason. But this kind of structural imbalance that's taking place, that's causing men to become more feminine and more like women, is obviously seeping into the reason why men are also becoming more weak. So we have to bear that in mind. That's another thing. When I turn on the TV, obviously there's this whole thing about toxic masculinity and so on and so forth, which I think is pushing people underground. There's a reason why people like Andrew Tate and that got so popular. It's because there's still a section of young men that want to express that side of things, but they can't, because they feel like if they do say anything that goes outside the narrative, they're going to get absolutely bashed and trampled on. The argument has become so imbalanced that now there's guys that have bought into the mainstream narrative, and they're the ones that just become big softies, and then there's a whole group of men that don't ever express those thoughts and feelings, but they also are not actually looking after themselves, because they're probably thinking, well, if I do anything that's masculine, they're going to call me toxic. I'm toxic if I do this, I'm toxic if I do that. So I think because of the imbalance of the argument, it's actually caused like an underground situation to happen, and now there's a disparity, and there's a lot of men that are not walking in their truth and they're being fake because they have to fit the narrative. Now that's just the way the world works at this current moment, and that's fine, but that also plays a part as to why some men are becoming more weak. there's a structural imbalance in the way that things are being done right now. The next thing is also, it's a societal thing in terms of just work life. Obviously, the way that we live our lives has changed a lot. Like, we're not working the same kind of jobs we used to. There's less men working in factories. There's less men doing a lot of manual labor jobs. That's just the way that technology and the way things have advanced, which means that more men are sitting in front of laptops all day. I sit in front of my laptop all day coaching, so I understand that. So that side of it is like, it's just the way that society has become. We're working in a whole different way than we did before, which has now caused men to be sitting down all day, not getting any steps, hence why extra weight gain. And guess what happens when you gain too much weight? Your body starts to produce more estrogen. You basically start pumping out more female hormones or more feminine hormones, which then makes it harder for you to actually have to build more muscle. And it almost becomes a vicious cycle, because your testosterone levels drop while your estrogen levels increase. And then we know that low testosterone is correlated with low muscle mass and high body fat, but then the high body fat causes more estrogen. So you can see how it just becomes a vicious cycle. The way that our modern lives are, where people sit at desk all day and they don't move and they don't get any steps, is causing obviously men to become weaker because of that. So that's the second thing. Another thing is the food, the food that we're eating. There's a lot of foods that actually are causing men to have lower testosterone, lower sperm counts. Sometimes people blame women about fertility issues. Sometimes it's the men, and not all of them, but sometimes it's actually the men. Drinking all the time, smoking all the time, excess body fat. Of course it's going to be hard to conceive because your sperm's probably trash. So that's another thing. The food, everything's processed now. Fast food is easier to eat more than ever. It's cheaper, generally speaking. Although I personally think you can eat healthy on a budget, or relatively healthy on a budget. Like, generally speaking, it's cheaper. So the food industry is kind of pumping out nonsense and processed crap, which means that it's making it harder for people. And then they also a lot of guys don't have the education in regards to how to eat more healthily or what's good for you. So all of this just becomes a vicious cycle that causes men specifically to stay weak. And that's what's happening. They're staying weak. I talk to guys and I'm like, how many pull-ups can you do? I can't even do a pull-up. How many push-ups can you do? I can't do a full push-up. How long can you plank? I can't even plank for 30 seconds. Like, there's a lot of guys who just can't even do simple stuff. So there's a reason for that. And there's a woman, I can't remember her name, but she always talks about protein and stuff. I need to start getting better at giving credit where I get some of this information from. But she did a podcast and she spoke about how we always talk about this 60% of the population's obese or overweight and stuff, but we never talk about how there's also a lack of strength problem, because alongside that, there's a long list of guys who also have no physical strength. They can't squat their own body weight. They can't even bench press. They can't deadlift. They can't do push-ups. They can't even run a 5K. There's a lot of guys out there who physically they're inept outside of having the body fat. Because if we focused on them being more, if there was more emphasis and more onus on them being better at doing physical things, then the likelihood is their body fat would be lower anyway, right? Because the more muscle you have, your metabolism increases. It might not be significant, but it increases still. It helps you actually process glucose better, so it helps you process sugar better when you have more muscle. Like, there's a lot more benefits to having more muscle in your body than to be weak, and obviously carrying excess body fat. So do we have an obesity problem, or do we have a lack of strength, a lack of muscle, a lack of movement problem? I think it's the latter. The more that I read about it, I think it's the latter. That's why modern men are weak. So we need to get to the real nitty gritty here, and it's how can we help modern men get stronger? And this is really where my passion lies. And I think that there's a few things we can talk about here that can really drill this home, but I'll start with some basic stuff. The first thing is in the mind. It's all in the mind. I think that we have to let men have their spaces where, they're not toxic, but they can be themselves. They don't feel like they have to be shunned by the mainstream narratives that are always being pumped out. They can have their circles and do what they want and say what they want, as long as they're not hurting anybody, they're not disrespecting people. We need to have it, because I'll say it again, there's a reason why guys like Andrew Tate and that became so popular, because there's a section of men that are crying out for something. Obviously there's a section of men that there's something missing, which is why those guys can get so popular, saying like controversial things about women and stuff like that. There's a reason for that. Whether you agree or disagree is besides the point. That stuff doesn't happen overnight. Like, that's been brewing. There's clearly, so if you're a guy, and I hate to use this term, but I start to agree a bit more, is like, you've got to kind of unplug from the matrix a little bit and kind of stay away from the mainstream narrative and do a bit more reading, and it's a mental shift that you have to make. You have to make a mental shift. That's the first thing. The next thing, start investing in yourself, whether that's business courses, whether that's mentorships, whether that's obviously health and fitness, getting a coach. You have to make an investment in yourself, and you have to really view yourself as the prize and level up yourself first before thinking about, before worrying about anything else. Because the better you make yourself, the easier it is when you enter new spaces, you know, because you walk with a sense of self-confidence and a sense of self-belief that, you know, you feel unstoppable. And I think that those kind of things it's underrated. It's very underrated what self-development and self-investment can do for you. I'm a big advocate for it, and I think that most men need to really be doing more of that. Another thing is learning a combat sport. Jiu-jitsu, boxing, kickboxing, Muay Thai, boxing. Did I say boxing? Said boxing twice. Like, learn a combat sport. I think men fighting is like primal. You don't understand. Whether you're getting beaten up or you're beating someone up in a controlled environment, I think it's primal. I think it's just been something that we've done for hundreds of years. And even though now we live a much more domesticated life, it's still quite gladiatorish when you're in the gym. Like when I'm getting beat up in Muay Thai, as much as I hate getting beaten up at that time, in my mind I'm like, this is what we're supposed to be doing, man. Like, this is how I'm gonna get better. It's the most humbling experience, because then you know, okay, I'm never gonna rest on my laurels when I know that this guy, he just kicked my ass. I'm coming back. I'm gonna come back. I'm just gonna keep coming back until I get better. And that mentality is something that I then now apply in all these other areas of my life. So I do think that men should learn to do some kind of combat sport. And the more you get beaten up, I think that, like, the braver you become, honestly. So that's that. And the third thing is food, man. You got to start fueling your body. You got to stop eating these estrogen causing foods. There's a lot of foods that we eat nowadays that are actually increasing the estrogen in our body, lowering our testosterone, making us weaker, making us more tired, so we have less energy. There's a lot of things that we're doing that are not fueling ourselves, and a lot of this also causes us to suffer in other areas of our lives. So we have low self-esteem. We don't think too highly of ourselves. We have brain fog. We start to feel all these things because we're not doing all the other things first. We're not getting our exercise. We're not eating right. We're not eating real food. We're just eating all this processed junk that is then causing more estrogen. Get your food right. Start eating as much natural foods as possible. Try to make your diet at least 70 to 80% whole foods. A whole food is basically a one ingredient food. Stop eating all this processed junk that's coming in packages and stuff like that. If you want to become the strongest and best version of yourself, and you don't want to be like 65% of these modern men who are obviously, you know, very, very weak. And I applaud anybody who's actively pursuing excellence. That's it. If you're actively pursuing it, and yeah, you might be in that 65% of being overweight or out of shape, I applaud you right now if you're actively in the process of being coached, getting into your fitness journey and getting better, and actually trying to lose the weight and get in better shape and improve your testosterone and like be a leader for your family. Like, that's very, very important. Those are qualities that we need now more than ever, I personally think. And there's a famous saying, and I can't remember what the saying is. I'm gonna have to get my phone for this one. I can't remember what the saying is, but you tell me if you guys agree with this one. There's a saying that goes, hard times create strong men create easy times create soft men create hard times. I'll leave the podcast there. If you can, whatever platform you're on, leave a comment. Where do you think we're at based on that quote? Peace.